This program is a presentation of UCTV for educational and non-commercial use only.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to follow Jean-Jacques Hublin because we agree on most things, which is not always the case in paleoanthropology, as I'm sure you're aware. I'm an anthropologist. Anthropology has a long love-hate relationship with art and with art history, as many of you probably know. We take a broad ethnographic comparative perspective, and I'm going to present some of that tonight. The title image here sort of reflects, I think, often the way that Paleolithic art gets represented in the literature, as if it's some version or some deep, distant root of the Western tradition, which it's almost certainly not. It also provides, I think, a very false picture of context, which we know a lot about. We don't have to imagine, we know a lot about for the Paleolithic records. So I'm going to show you some nice images a little later on. It would be too easy to show you nice images and have you ooh and ah about Paleolithic art. You all have seen photographs of Lascaux and Chauvet and all that, and you'll see some of those in a few minutes. But I want to talk about some problems that we have as scholars interested in the evolution of art, if you like. One of them is the issue of art being somehow integral to our species. And there are a couple of documents in the record that give us trouble. One of them is that, at least in terms of the morphological structure of humans, we have people that we're willing to admit into our species, and even into our subspecies, some of us are at least, more than 100,000 years before we have any evidence, even of shells with holes pierced in them. And this raises a rather interesting question then for us. This object, which is one of the earliest representations of some external world object, and I was pleased to hear Jean-Jacques talk about this aspect. It's really here in the vicinity of 35 to 40,000 when we begin to see the first representations of real-world objects in other media. We're here at 34,000 in southern Germany, fully 160,000 years after the earliest members of our species in East Africa. This raises for us as evolutionists a rather impressive question. We're 130,000 years before we see these kinds of objects that Jean-Jacques has just shown you. Two things emerge from this. First of all, for us as evolutionists, is art a useful scientific category? And I think anthropology long ago abandoned the idea that art somehow was a useful social scientific category. There's a whole literature in social anthropology that is a critique of art as a social scientific category. Or is it an artifact of the Western tradition, which is the position that I think most anthropologists would take, although by convenience they use the term art. Many of you came here today because you saw art on the program, and I'm sorry to disabuse you of its value, although you're certainly free to disagree with me. Most of us in paleoanthropology talk rather about symbolic representation, which is a mouthful, and it's not as interesting as art, and it doesn't trigger all of that passion in our brains that art does. Is it a less ethnocentric category? Maybe. Is it a cultural invention, or is it mandated by hard wiring? Of course, this is the question that comes out of the fact that anything that we're willing to call art shows up 150 or 170,000 years after the first members of our species. What is the relationship between hard wiring in the brain and the first evidence, the first material evidence for things that we're willing to call symbolic representation? Well, there are a number of ways of thinking about all of this. And I think the record is still sufficiently ambiguous to allow us all to have our way in this. One of them is that the evolution of the capacity for symbolic representation was a gradual process over 2.5 million years, and the record more or less represents neurological changes that allowed for symbolic behavior. A second is, and a far more frequently encountered view, is that this is a very sudden process, and that it occurs somewhere between 100 and 40,000 years ago, long after the first emergence of members of our species, and that it's a rather revolutionary development. And finally, a third point of view, which I prefer to adhere to, is that the capacity evolved a long time ago for the kind of behavior that ultimately shows up in the record that we call art, but that something special was going on in the vicinity of 100 to 40,000 years ago that made it advantageous or even desirable to do some of the kinds of spectacular things that we see in caves or that people were wearing on their bodies. And of course, Jean-Jacques alluded to the fact that one of the really exciting things in human evolution that takes place in that period is the dispersal of anatomically modern humans, ultimately to replace all of these other populations that preceded them. Anthropologists like to be old-fashioned and to think in old-fashioned terms, and I was surprised actually that no one to this point has used the term metaphor. I'd like you to think about metaphors in a second. But the attribution of meaning to things and events in the external world seems to me to be a pretty important part of who we are as modern humans, at least, and it would be nice to be able to see how that plays out as we move back through time. But all of you are aware that there are a whole bunch of processes and concepts that we need to keep in mind when we think about this very complex package. And one of them is the whole notion of perception, which we know has a very important neurological component, but we also know has an extraordinarily powerful cultural component. And I'm here as an anthropologist to try to lend a cultural flavor to some of these questions. How is it that we construct meaning from material experience? Carolyn Bloomer was interested in the visual, and some of you have been very interested in the visual, but what about the material? Because we're not always operating in something that we can consider to be the visual medium. So how do we go from that real world out there with woolly mammoths roaming around and people watching them to the one in which, deep in a cave, you find a miniature sculpture, which we recognize as a woolly mammoth? What is that process anyway? And how does it fit into evolutionary perspectives? Well, I don't have to remind you how important culture is. Culture, in many ways, conditions your very perception of sounds and smells and other kinds of things. I do want to give you some examples that are relevant to our current subject here. And you can read any of this in any basic psychology of visual perception textbook. You know that you don't hear vibrations or feel vibrations in your eardrums. You hear sounds. So you know that perception is very deeply involved, and cultural perception is very deeply involved in immediately transforming what you perceive sensorially into some sort of meaningful experience. But how do we think about all this? How would we best think about the relationship between perception and symbolic representation? Representing what one perceives in nature, for example. And there are lots of terms that have been used. The terms that this symposium has found useful are art and aesthetics. But read, if any of you are trained in art history, you probably had the Jansen textbook. I understand just last week that our art history students at NYU are still suffering through Jansen after all of these years. I think it's in like the 17th edition or something like that, and he's been dead for I don't know how many decades. But how best, what concepts can we forge to understand this record? When does symbolic representation become art? And should we care? As people interested in the evolution of symbolism, should we care? Is art so embedded in our thing that we get lost in the fact that it may not have been the thing about the past at all? And if you've read any amount of ethnography at all, you know that we are actually one of the rare cultural traditions in which there's actually a word for art. And that raises another question. What do we do about cultures that produce things that we call art that don't even have a word for the category? Right? What is this thing, art, anyway? Well, years ago, 50s, George Mills set out to try to define in terms that were appropriate to anthropology the essential qualities of art, and he said that there were two approaches to it. One was in its formal organization, which is usually the approach of traditional art history, and the other was in its metaphorical potential. And I'd like to spend just a little time on metaphor, because I think that's really a critical part of what's going on here. You can see that Mills was no enemy of notions of art. He was trying to make sense of it, and he described it as controlled qualitative experience. But how do we control the qualitative experience of others? How do we evoke for them what we intend in something? Well, often we refer to this as art, and you can see Jansen doing backflips here to try to salvage the concept even in art history. First of all, a word, and then it's art because we call it art, it's an aesthetic object, and you can see that this isn't just an issue for art historians, but you can also see, or for anthropologists, but you can also see that he ends up by, for our purposes, placing museums, churches, and caves in the same category. So there's already a kind of projection, if you will, of things from the Western tradition. These are some of the premises of traditional art history, and you'll be insulted by these if you're an art historian, because they're really a traditional art history. I don't know why we get that version at NYU, but we do. And it's much more about appreciation and connoisseurship than it is about real art history. But you'll recognize all of these things, that art is about genius, it's about urges, it's about fulfilling innate needs. And all of these remain to be situated. Some of you have tried very nicely, I think, to situate these in the brain, and that's great. We should be doing that. But traditionally, none of these things have been situated in a way that makes them really appropriate to a scientific approach. And then, of course, there's all this stuff about different categories of art. Craftsmen make, artists create, right? You've heard that one before. Fine art or pure art is to be distinguished from applied art. Well, what are our Paleolithic people doing? What are those Chauvet people doing? Are they doing fine art? Are they doing pure art? Are they doing applied art if it's magic? Or is it just craft? And what are those pierced teeth? If they're jewelry, are they art? Do we care about them then? How do we include them in our approach to things? Just an example from Jansen. I always pick on poor Jansen. I should probably pick on living people because they can stand up for themselves. But Jansen spent a lot of time writing about, not a lot of time, he spent a page and a half. Well, you know his book, writing about Altamira. And this is a very famous image from Altamira that he wrote about, and this was what he wrote about it. Using terms like wonderful wounded bison, dying animal, collapsed on the ground, vivid, lifelike, keen observation, assured vigorous outlines, subtly controlled shading, bulk and roundness, power, dignity, agony. This is a 13,000-year-old painting which is being made to carry an enormous amount of subjective baggage, right? And I don't mean to pick on him, I just mean to give a sense that there's a very real danger in being affected by places like Altamira in a way that simply allows us to fulfill all of our own cultural expectations and assumptions. Well, this is the real bison from Altamira, and this is its context. And of course, what Jansen doesn't tell you is a whole bunch of stuff he doesn't tell you. You don't want to read all this, but he doesn't tell you a whole bunch of stuff, but including the fact that that first of all, the bison is part of a panel with 27 other bison, but secondly, that in and among the animals, the painted animals, are more than 70 engraved animals that are not the same species as the ones that are painted, right? And secondly, it's not on the wall of a cave, as Jansen says, it's on the ceiling, which changes your experience of it rather dramatically. So one of the things that a modern paleoanthropology does first and foremost is to try to, as best as archaeology can, contextualize these things before jumping to these kinds of descriptions that already have interpretation built fundamentally into them. Okay, so well, you all know that anthropology is about other cultures, and that we always disprove people's claims by saying, oh, some culture somewhere in the central desert of Australia does it this way, so that proves that it's not universal. But in many cases, that argument is justified. I'd like to just explore a little bit this business of metaphor, which art historians and Aristotelians have seen as a rather important and interesting aspect. And for me, in much of what is Paleolithic, so-called Paleolithic art, much of it, I think, can be categorized as something that is evocative in a metaphorical way. That is, the images make reference to something that is not inherent in the images. Some old things by Lakoff and Johnson, which I think are really good, that show just to what degree metaphors structure our very understanding or grasping of the world around us. The most intangible things we grasp by metaphors that refer to the most tangible things. And I suspect that that's what's going on, right? This falls very nicely into one of the presentations we had this morning, but I beg of you to seek the relationship between the images that you have here and all that emotional stuff that they evoke for you. There is nothing inherent in the image on the upper left that has anything to do with love whatsoever, except in a particular cultural context with a particular set of accepted metaphors, right? And the same thing could be said of the other image itself. So, what's that got to do with Paleolithic art? Well, it has a lot to do with Paleolithic art. What's actually being represented on the walls of places like Lascaux and Chauvet? Well, it's hard to know. It's very clear that certain animal species are being selected for. They most often have nothing to do with the animals that are being eaten. They're animals that are being thought about and represented. We often have the associations of particular species in a very structured way. There are something like 16 horses in this panel, many of them underlying this rather large aurochs. And we often overlook, in the sort of dynamism, if you like, of these images, we often overlook the very complicated business of why anybody would do this in the first place. And it's even more complicated now that it's been shown that in Lascaux, all the horses were done first. They went through the entire cave, painted all the horses, and then they inserted the other animals in around them. So what are these relationships? Well, we have those, right? Imagine yourself 20,000 years from now coming on this image, right? Or this one. How's that? We have complicated notions about animals. They're metaphors for certain kinds of things, and I'll spare you all of the sports names of all of the teams in the different conferences. But I think we have to open our minds here and to see many of these images not as representations of what they are, but as representations of very powerful metaphors that these cultures are trafficking in. Think about it another way. Think about it in the way of what animals actually mean to you, right? What is a horse? What does this evoke for you? Someone who's a representative of the Western tradition, someone who's grown up with horses in a particular context. What does that horse actually mean for you? Can you actually see this horse like a Magdalenian 18,000 years ago saw it without the various metaphors and associations we have? I would argue no. I would argue that different cultures, even closely related cultures, have very different relationships to nature that are embedded in the representations of that nature, and I would argue that the Paleolithic is no exception. And if you think Americans are excluded from this, well, there's a very interesting. Go online and look for horses and conflicts with French culture and all sorts of things, because we have ideas about animals and what's appropriate to eat and what's appropriate to paint and what's appropriate to think and what's noble and what's clean and what's not. While I may not show you these fantastic Paleolithic images, I hope I can get you to think about those images in a way that perhaps you haven't thought about them before. Sorry for the profanity, but I thought this was just too good to pass up. We do have animal metaphors that are very profound and allow us to talk about things that are very difficult and complicated to grasp and to talk about, including conflicts between nations and such matters. Again, I challenge you to find this 2,000 years from now and know what the hell anybody is talking about. All right. To accommodate all of this, I have constructed what I call different cultural logics of representation, and I think we can get at some of those archaeologically. But we have to come to terms with the fact that different cultures have extraordinarily different notions about even what an image is, about its power. When we say an image is powerful, that tends to mean that it's moving somehow. But if you were to talk to a Central Desert Australian about the power of an image, that would be basically the electrical force that it generated when you touched it and what threw you to the ground. Right? The images actually have physical power. Representations are going to feel very different on the walls if they're constructed out of those different views of things. In the San, the southern San from southern Africa, the rock support is a threshold to the spirit world. It's not a surface. You're going to put very different things on that, quote, surface if you're thinking of it as a veil that separates you from a parallel spiritual universe. Right? So I think we need to be really quite careful about projecting art outside of our own particular tradition. And just a final wonderful example from the Inuit, in which all representation has embedded in it the fact that everything in the world is transitory, and that one thing changes into another. These are two views of the same image. You can see with, I think, 9 strokes, this Inuit produced something that is quite extraordinary, a caribou in 2 different poses. Right? And even something as fundamental as realism. There's an old French guy back from the 20s named Georges Luquet, who made a distinction between réalisme intellectuel and réalisme visuel. And he did that because certain ethnographically studied people in Africa were much more content and interested in the image at the right than they were in the image at the left. Why? Because it has more information. It's more realistic. You actually see more of the animal. We're into visual realism. A lot of other cultures are into another kind of realism that we need to be careful about not ignoring. And finally, let me just show you some very nice images from the Grotte Chauvet. But let's keep something in mind while we're doing that. These are deep, dark caves. What is a cave? We have a certain metaphor for caves, even. And I often say to my students that if we knew what caves were to Paleolithic people, we'd be halfway to knowing why they were down there and why they were painting what they were painting on the walls 32,000 years ago. A final example I think, to make you even more uncomfortable, which is that this image has been reproduced in a lot of art textbooks recently. It's from Chauvet. It's a particular piece of a particular panel, and it's often described as a frieze of painted horses. When I taught my prehistoric art class at NYU, I had a person who raised horses in the crowd, and she came up after class after she saw this image, and she said, "That's not a frieze of horses. Those 4 horses could never exist in the same space in real life. They're all doing fundamentally different things: fleeing, sleeping, at rest, etc." In fact, it's not a representation of space, of a spatial relationship. It's a representation of time, of one horse in 4 different phases, if you like. Be really careful, I think, about imposing our rules on this distant past. I love this image because if you look at these horses, they're the product literally of tens of hours of work by very accomplished people who are preparing the surfaces. And you may not have seen this image, but it just shows you how wonderfully well preserved Chauvet is. Every last stroke of the tool is preserved on that surface. And then there's the thing to close about the combinations and the associations of things that fall beyond, I think, for the moment, our comprehension. What is the relationship on the same panel between a lion in profile, a bison in profile, and the lower legs and sexual anatomy of a human woman? Right? They're doing some very complicated things based upon very complicated worldviews and very complicated values that I think the very notion of art makes it too easy to ignore. I guess that's the point I'd like to leave you with, is that, as I said before, I could show you wonderful pictures and you'd ooh and ah, but I think it's much more important to begin to think about how to tease something out of these that's faithful to the original people who did them and not simply faithful to the way that we project onto the distant past. I'll leave it there. Thank you.